Good afternoon, everyone, to our October 30th public meeting. We're very excited for you to be here today. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Today, we're going to have a great agenda of, we have 4 speakers lined up. First, we have Franco Montalto from Drexel University, who's going to be talking about increased rainfall and what we should do about it. And Cody Herrmann is going to be presenting on the water quality results from the community water quality testing program, and showing 2023-2024 differences that we're seeing, and is soliciting input on why we're seeing such a difference between the 2 years. And then Emily Ruby and Drew Gamels from Riverkeeper are going to be updating us on where we are in the Renewable Rikers program and the status of PCBs. And then at the end, we are going to open up the floor to anyone who has any public notices that they would like to share with the rest of the group. And just so you know, we will be having an upcoming cloudburst presentation the week of November 18th from DEP. And as soon as that is scheduled and confirmed, we will be sending out a registration link. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Montalto and have him share with us what his research and the work of the New York City PCC has come up with.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay? You can hear me and see my screen?
Yes, you can.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks for the opportunity to to talk to you today. It's kind of exciting actually, because I was around when SWIM first formed back when the city, I guess right after the city was developing its Plan YC, and then ultimately trying to make a decision about green infrastructure. And it's really exciting to be back and have an opportunity to talk to you all today about some of my more recent work. So I'm a professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, but I'm a native New Yorker. And actually, before I started doing research at Drexel, I founded a company in New York City called eDesign Dynamics, which does work around green infrastructure and urban ecological restoration work. So that's just a little bit about me. The work that I'll talk to you today came about, well, I was a member of the Northeast chapter of the National Climate Assessment 5 that just came out last year. So I have a little bit in here from NCA 5 to give sort of like a regional perspective. But then I was a member of NPCC 4. I'll talk a little bit about what NPCC is, and I'll be a member of NPCC 5, and that's a local program, a local group of volunteer scientists and researchers who who bring climate change research into the city. And some of this other work comes from a town and gown project that I had with some other researchers around the city. So I'll sort of draw from these different resources. Let me advance. Okay. So just to give you the sort of really high level picture, this whole region is getting wetter. We know that days with heavy precipitation have increased, and in the National Climate Assessment, the Northeast chapter that just came out, which I was mentioning earlier, there was this sort of set of figures that show days with 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches, 5 inches of precipitation increasing over time in our region. And in another chapter of NCA that compares sort of heaviest precipitation or days with heavy precipitation, you see the Northeast is the region that has the greatest overall historical increase. So that's sort of the regional context on precipitation. Sea level rise, as you know, the sea level has been increasing locally. The rate depends on what you're comparing to, what base period you're comparing to, and then how vertically the land is moving at the same time that the sea is rising. So there's something called relative sea level rise. And then going forward, the projections sort of depend on what future greenhouse gas emissions you assume, or what global climate models you use for this projection. But in general, here you can see in the lower right, I mean, this is again for the region. I wanted to kind of give a regional perspective, but you can see in the lower right, the projections from NPCC for New York City. And you can see the different percentiles, when you're talking about climate change, given all of the uncertainty about how the future will play out. We always present our results sort of with a range, but you can see, so by the end of the century, something like between 25 inches and 65 inches relative to the historical baseline period of rise. So it's getting wetter, and we're having, and the sea is getting higher, and as a result, flooding is an issue that we talk about. So what I wanted to do is give you a little bit of background on NPCC and VIA. What are these initiatives? Maybe I'll go through that relatively quickly since I know I only have about 30 minutes. Then just give some of the key findings of the VIA project about extreme precipitation in the city, but then spend the bulk of the presentation talking about the flooding chapter of NPCC that just was published along with the rest of the NPCC chapters a few months ago. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, we go through all the different types of flooding that occur in New York City. We go through hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and the sort of responses. So it's a pretty elaborate chapter. It's a long chapter, and I'll give you the highlights today. Just really quickly, so NPCC stands for the New York City Panel on Climate Change. It was encoded in Local Law 42, and it's really a group of volunteer scientists predominantly who support the city in fulfilling the goals of Plan YC, but also specifically bringing in the state-of-the-art climate science and climate risk information into the sort of public discussion in New York City. And there's a panel, the NPCC panels go on for 4 years, and NPCC 4 just concluded. NPCC 5 is about to be launched. Actually, the first organizational meeting is next week. The NPCC is an assessment, which means that we don't actually do research. We review the state of the art, and we sort of interpret and synthesize that information for decision makers. NPCC is unique because it focuses on the 5 boroughs of New York City, and that distinguishes it from, for example, from the New York State Climate Impact Assessment, or as I mentioned, the National Climate Assessment. The state obviously is the state. The National Climate Assessment is looking at the nation broken up into individual regions, and there's a New York City work fits in the Northeast region. Again, on NPCC, we've issued, the panel has issued multiple reports, and the most recent report, NPCC 4, came out in 2024. VIA is, VIA stands for the Climate Vulnerability Impact and Adaptation team. And this was a funded research initiative by the city, led by the New School, but including a lot of other academic partners that you can see, and non-academic partners as well over to the right there. And this happened sort of in concert with NPCC 4. And so it was an 18-month research initiative where we were actually able to do new science. And a lot of that science then supported NPCC 4. And there was sort of cross-fertilization. So many NPCC researchers were on the VIA team and vice versa. I focused on these 2 initiatives on what I'm going to talk about today. For NPCC, I was the co-chair of the flooding working group. And on VIA, I was in what's called Task 3, which was focusing on extreme precipitation. And so I want to sort of present the VIA stuff first and then get into the NPCC stuff. I will mention that VIA was, we were required to, not required, but we wanted to, but we were also asked to take a participatory approach to this work. And some of you may have been contacted by us. We developed a sustainable a stormwater advisory committee that included a variety of folks around the city. But we reached out to decision makers, transactors, meaning sort of folks who negotiate between various interest groups and the city and the general public. And so it was the research was conducted in a participatory way. So let me just go through really quickly. This is kind of bullets just to kind of give you the summary of what the VIA Task 3, the focus on extreme precipitation, what we found. one of the things we wanted to do was really to kind of consolidate in one place. It seems strange that this has not been done before, but consolidate in one place the different types of precipitation data that are used for planning stormwater in New York City. And as you likely know, the 5 and 10-year storms are the most common. But when you look at the documents that reference the 5 and 10-year storms, you often are sort of left wanting for more information regarding the duration of the storm, the temporal distribution. So if we say there's a 10-year storm is so much precipitation over 24 hours, how is it distributed in those 24 hours? Where did that precipitation amount come from? You know, the plumbing code, for example, talks about a certain amount of precipitation. Where did they get that number? So there's sort of a lack of detail and certainly not synchronization between these different plans. Precipitation data, believe it or not, with all the flooding that's going on, is relatively limited. So we have hourly data for New York, KNYC, Central Park, LaGuardia, Newark Airport, to some extent JFK, although we have, there's a large gap in JFK, and KVDR is Sikorsky Airport in Connecticut. So if you want to look at trends in precipitation, we have hourly data at these gauges from the mid-20th century on. Sub-hourly data, you know, as you know, some of the floods that we've been having are these like extremely short duration, high intensity rainfall events. And when the time interval at which precipitation is gathered is hourly, you don't see necessarily those intense sort of hyper-local pulses. Sub-hourly data at 1 minute time step is available for the 21st century, but unfortunately it's not quality controlled, which means that when you start looking at the data, you see gaps, you see strange numbers at different places. So it's very difficult for us to analyze trends in precipitation at the temporal scale, at this 1 minute scale that we need in order to talk about these cloudburst events that we keep hearing about. So this is just kind of important to keep in mind. That said, when we analyze this data, the region is getting wetter, as you know, as I said earlier, for the entire Northeast. Total annual precipitation, to some extent seasonal precipitation, and precipitation event totals in general, whether they're big events or small events, those have all increased significantly at all the New York City area gauges. The other thing that's increased is the frequency of these very extreme events. So events that we define as above the 95th percentile of all historical events with respect to intensity. So we're seeing more intense events, but interestingly, in the analysis of this data, when we look at the actual amount of precipitation or the intensity of those events, it hasn't changed too much relative to the historic values. So in other words, you put this together, we're getting more big events. They're occurring more frequently, but their individual characteristics at least at the scale at which we were able to analyze them using this hourly data has not changed much over time. That said, extreme precipitation characteristics we all know have changed. And you've got really localized pulses of precipitation that make it really difficult to analyze. So for example, some of these, like Ida, you might have seen it as a really extreme sort of sequence of precipitation at one of the regional gauges. But if you looked at a different gauge, you would have seen a different pattern to that event. With the VIA project, the folks who are on our team from Cornell went forward and used a method called quantile mapping to come up with what we call delta change factors. So these are numbers that you can apply to historical precipitation amounts to estimate how much larger they would be in the future. And the way this happens is you compare, you use global climate models, you use a number of global climate models, and you compare certain precipitation baseline periods with certain future periods in the models, and then the ratio of those two gives you a delta change factor. And what you can see here is on the right hand side, SSP 585 and SSP, which is SSP 585 is SSP stands for shared socioeconomic pathways. They're one of the ways that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, talks about things like emissions and land use and population changes. So you could think of this as a scenario that's sort of at the higher end of what we might expect in the future in terms of emissions and our ability to control them. And you have in the upper part 2020 to 2069, and the lower part 2050 to 2099. And then you've got these different return periods, or the reciprocal of the annual probability of experience. So a 100-year storm has a 1% chance of occurring every year, for example. And you see then these different percentiles based on the variability that there is in the work, in the global climate models. And what you see, if you look at sort of the mean value, so let's pick an average. And if you look at end of century, so the lower plot, for the 100-year storm, you could see up to a delta change factor of about 1.3. That means sort of a 30% increase in the amount of precipitation of a 100-year storm, for example, compared to what that 100-year storm looked like in the past. So that's, and this is for SSP 585. If we looked at a scenario, a shared socioeconomic pathway that assumes that we're better able globally to control emissions, it goes down a little bit, but not much. And what you can see, so that the story here is that these extreme rainfall events are likely to get bigger and more intense going forward. One of the things, I mentioned earlier that if you look at the city's various planning documents, they tell you, talk about the 10-year storm, talk about the 5-year storm, but then they don't tell you much about the temporal distribution of those storms. And what we found in our research, we did some folks at Arcadis were on our team, and they did some modeling. And what they found is that your assumption about how, let's say 100-year, just to make it easy, let's talk about a 100-year 24-hour storm, whether that 100-year 24-hour storm, sort of peaks early and then flattens out, or peaks late, or peaks in the middle, or doesn't peak as uniform, can yield significant differences in forecasted flooding. So if we apply those precipitation patterns in our models, we get different results. And actually they're at the same order of magnitude, like 30%, for example, as assuming that the precipitation amounts get greater in the future. So it's this we have a need, and this is one of the recommendations we have, of really getting more precise in terms of how we measure precipitation, and then the assumptions of what we assume when we're using models to inform change. Another interesting result that we had here is that, which may seem surprising to you, is that in the future, our modeling suggests that the smaller events, so the more frequently occurring events, like the 2-year storm, for example, are more likely to produce new flooding, than the bigger events. And the reason for this is because the bigger events today already exceed the capacity of our drainage system. So they already produce a flood. The flood might be a little bigger, but there's already a flood when that type of an event occurs. But what we're going to see more and more is smaller events, or that today are satisfactorily collected collected and conveyed through our drainage system, will be unable to do so when they're inflated by a certain amount in the future. So that suggests that smaller, more regularly occurring rain events are more likely to create flooding are more likely to create flooding that will also be accompanied occasionally by these larger events, which will continue to remain infrequent. So we recommend protocols for quality controlled measurement of sub-hourly precipitation across New York City, and of course, also upstate watersheds. We're not talking about drinking water here, but we need this type of data there. And we need more standardization in terms of how we are representing precipitation into planning and operations and modeling and everything that supports that work. So that was kind of a summary of what we came up with in VIA. I'm realizing that I've already gone through 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to try to go quickly through the NPCC work. Flood risk is determined by the magnitude and the frequency of flood hazards. But when you talk about risk, when you use the word risk, the hazard has to occur, but people, property, infrastructure also have to be exposed to it. And of course, those people, those demographic groups, those infrastructure systems that are most vulnerable will have the most negative impacts associated with that. But the risk is also a function of our response. So the degree to which we have done things to prepare for the hazards. And if we do things that we think are going to be beneficial, but actually make things worse, that's called maladaptation. So that's also a factor here. So the NPCC flooding chapter, which it seems like we'll only have a little bit of time to talk about today, breaks this down. And it starts with these images that were generated by Eric Sanderson that look on the left-hand side at sort of historical land cover in the city, and you see the green are the historical intertidal marshes, and the blue are the historical freshwater streams. And then in the middle is sort of the coastal flood hazard areas, which you'll notice, no surprise, overlap very nicely with the historical wetlands. And then on the right, from the city's stormwater resiliency maps, the extreme stormwater flood. So this is, due to precipitation, and those overlap in many ways with the historical stream. So to a great extent, the hazards that we experience today are a function of the historical patterns of development on top of the ecological context that we had here. So there are 4 principal types of flooding in New York. One of the reasons I think there's a lot of confusion when people talk about flooding is we confound these different types of flooding hazards. I'll talk about them in a moment. Each one of them has a different geography of exposure. So the same people who are exposed to a coastal flood, or the people who are exposed to a coastal flood, are not necessarily going to be those who are exposed to a fluvial flood or a pluvial flood. And then, of course, we can have compound floods, which are different flood hazard types occurring together. This is a graphic that we put in there to sort of differentiate between the different types. So pluvial flooding is rainfall-induced flooding, right? That's flooding that occurs when the rate at which precipitation is coming out of the air exceeds the rate at which it can either be collected in a sewer system or infiltrated into the ground. And then that, what's often called rainfall excess, accumulates on the surface and causes a pluvial flood. A fluvial flood is different. That's in a place like the Bronx River, for example, when you have a lot of water trying to move down a stream corridor, and in particular, a stream corridor where the edges have been highly urbanized, highly developed. If the water can't stay within the bank, it overflows and causes a fluvial flood. So that you might have a fluvial flood in a place where you haven't had any rain because it's a function of the rainfall that occurred further upstream. Then, of course, there's coastal floods, and we've all been through Sandy, so we know what those are. That's when a storm surge or an extreme high tide pushes up onto the land surface. And less discussed, but increasingly of interest, are groundwater floods. And that's when, because of increased precipitation, I mentioned the region is getting wetter, or because of sea level rise, I mentioned the water level in the ocean is getting higher, the groundwater table rises. And when that happens, it can more frequently get into sewer pipes, get into subsurface structures like like subway tunnels or basements. There's also groundwater flooding that's been triggered because of the change in pumping of groundwater. There are certain sections of Queens that were developed when we were pumping groundwater out of the aquifer and using it. And then when we stopped pumping the groundwater out of the aquifer, the water table sort of what we call rebounded, came up higher, and then a lot of the subsurface infrastructure was exposed. So these all have different geographies of exposure. And then, just compound flooding is the co-occurrence of multiple hazards. And the most common type of compound flood is when you have a tropical cyclone like a hurricane that causes heavy rain and storm surge to occur simultaneously. That's sort of like the classical example of a compound flood. We have some images this is in the chapter that just shows sort of an example of how a compound coastal and groundwater flood. So you see the water level on the coast coming up, and that's raising the water table such that it intersects with basements or storm pipes, for example. Pluvial flood risks, we often talk about flood plains, but classical flood plains, the area where a river overflows onto the banks, really are not relevant in New York City. As we've seen from recent events, you can have a pluvial flood anywhere in the city. There's anywhere in the city where intense precipitation can fall and exceed the capacity of the stormwater system or the pervious surfaces to infiltrate it into the ground, you can have a pluvial flood. So in that regard, we're all in a pluvial flood risk area. Fluvial floods are localized to places where we have rivers and streams. So a lot of our rivers and streams have been paved over or piped. But, in the Bronx and Staten Island, we still have some places where we have fluvial flood risks. High tides affect the coastal areas, and groundwater tables where you have groundwater flooding are places that are usually near the coast. So, Jamaica Bay area, for example, is one of those places. Just keeping track of time. Give me the hook when you need me to go. I'll try to go quickly. I think you said I have about another 10 minutes.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. So flood hazards, certainly the depth of inundation, this graph on the right is showing during Ida, the flood stage at the Bronx River, and you can see, it went up higher than the major flood stage. So the depth of inundation is something that we care about, but we also care about the amount of time that you have a high depth, how quickly the flood occurs, right? If the flood occurs very quickly, there's often not enough time to evacuate. The velocity can, the water, when it rises rapidly, can have high velocities that can cause erosion, that can move vehicles, waves, water chemistry. A lot of our floods sort of convey to us pollutants, especially if it's occurring at the time of a sewer overflow, for example. We've had incidents of folks getting electrocuted in New York City due to flooding and down power lines. But factors that affect the severity of the flood hazards have to do with sort of climate change. But then, as I was mentioning, this pattern of urbanization, this ongoing landfilling, dredging, changes to the groundwater extraction rate, which I talked about, and then, of course, impacts to natural and nature-based solutions. Exposure, I'll just, it's sort of straightforward. It's the presence of people or infrastructure in the flood hazard area. And again, I'm going to go fast, but we've started in the city to now map historical flood exposure. And these are just some of the recent efforts, the stormwater resiliency study in 2021. Other efforts have come out. And we've also started now to map future flood hazard areas, taking the research, again, beyond the traditional FEMA floodplains into other areas. Vulnerability is then in those exposure areas, who's the most vulnerable? And one of the things that came out of NPCC 4 and VIA actually as well, that's interesting is this what we're calling the New York City Flood Susceptibility to Harm and Recovery Index. I know that's a mouthful, but it takes these parameters that are showed in the box, and it then maps the city and looks at who is the most vulnerable to flooding. And the sort of high level message there is residents of 1 to 2 unit residential buildings and structures, specifically with subgrade basements, and then elderly, disabled, low income groups that have been historically marginalized in different ways. And this graphic is in here. We did through VIA, we did some work just trying to estimate or to measure, actually to inventory, I should say, how many flood related fatalities there have been in New York City. The answer is 52 since 1987, and you can see some of them listed here. But here's that index superimposed on top of a map of the census tracts in the city. And so you can see vulnerability varies greatly around the city. And so one of the things, before I get into that, I was just going to say, we also inventoried the impacts of floods when they occur. And there were a variety of different ways that we did this, but the major impact, the most commonly occurring impact that we notice is transit disruptions, whether it's mass transit or roadway disruptions. But you can see here when those fatalities occurred and when there have been injuries and property damage, et cetera. We do spend a lot of time in the chapter talking about how ecosystems are vulnerable to flooding too. And this is the first time, I think, that in any of the NPCC reports really talked about the city's natural areas and the impacts, for example, of salinity on coastal systems, the impacts of waves on plants, the impacts of urban, of intense precipitation on trees. And this is relevant because, the ecosystems have historically been one of our lines of defense. And if we impact ecosystems further, we're reducing the ability of natural systems to provide their component of the protection that we have. And I'm going to skip this quickly because I want to get into what we did with this stuff. In the chapter, we start to take that flood vulnerability index and superimpose it on top of the hazard exposure maps and produce maps that look like this. And I don't really have too much time to talk it through, but this is sorting NYCHA properties that are exposed to pluvial flooding now and in the future, and you can see a change. Or we could look at, I mentioned the 1 to 2 unit residential buildings that are at risk to, or that are vulnerable to pluvial flooding now with 100-year, this is NYCHA buildings with 100-year storm surge. So there's a lot of maps here. I don't have time to talk about them all, but you'll find these in that chapter. And it's really interesting and telling to show how the geography of exposure and vulnerability varies based on the hazard type. So I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes. We felt very, very strongly in the NPCC flooding chapter that we didn't want to just talk about the problems without talking about how to plan responses. And so we have a whole section in there on flood risk management, structural and non-structural responses. And there's this little chapter, this little figure here that shows structural approaches on the left, things like dry flood-proofing buildings, keeping the water out, wet flood-proofing buildings, allowing the water in, building natural and engineered systems to keep water out, elevating buildings, et cetera. And those being distinguished from non-structural approaches, early warning systems, evacuation plans, various buyouts or land swaps, capacity building on the other side. We differentiate between 3 broad categories of flood risk management that are out there. There's the resistance approach, which is basically keep the water away. And then there are 2 different resilience approaches or ways of dealing with or acknowledging and responding to the changes that are occurring and will continue to occur. And then those are the adaptive approach and the transformation approach. One of the things that we note is that the resistance strategies, the urge to build a barrier, can be fast, it can be easy, relatively speaking, but it often prioritizes flood control over other things that we might want to do, like create or conserve or restore natural systems. Once you build a barrier or a physical system like that, it's difficult to change them. They can also create a false sense of security for folks who feel, think Hurricane Katrina, that they're behind the barrier and they're therefore safe. And as a result, when those types of systems fail, the consequences can be worse. And there's even some research out there that says that regular flooding, sort of episodic flooding, actually builds the capacity of communities to deal with it. So that's kind of the pros and cons of the resistance strategies. The resilience strategies can help to adapt and transform, but this now is sort of like green infrastructure. It's kind of the decentralized approach. So local stakeholders, residents, others have to have access to information and resources. They also need agency in decision making. So how are these decisions about protecting the city from flooding? Who's making those decisions? And do stakeholders have a role? Do residents have a role in that? The one thing that's really interesting in the literature is that taking an adaptive approach or sort of shifting it to a decentralized approach, getting people to do things in their houses, is also unintentionally perhaps shifting the management of flood responsibility from government to flood vulnerable groups. And that may or may not be something that we want to do. And it's also, in a diverse and complex city like New York, there are a lot of social and institutional and logistical factors that need to be considered. And some of these strategies imply really significant, if you start talking about moving people out of a neighborhood, really significant equity and demographic and cultural changes that can be either positive or negative and need to be considered. We also, and I'll sort of wrap this up, talk a lot about the sewer system. The sewer system can help, but the sewer system also has limitations. Where we've effectively and historically had inlets, the ability of the system hydraulically to convey the flow, and what happens when the sewer system is full. We have a whole section there, which I don't have time to talk about, on what you can and can't do with nature-based solutions. It's really important to incorporate nature-based solutions into our approach, but we can't, with the space that we have, they need to be part of a hybrid approach. And we go through all of the things that nature-based solutions can and can't do. And I don't have time, unfortunately, to talk through them right now, but
actually, it's okay. You know what? This group probably cares the most about that. So go ahead and take a little time to do that.
Oh, okay. I'll just say, so in the report, we went through the literature about how natural and nature-based solutions work. And so, for example, wetlands can reduce surges by 1 to, say, 25 centimeters. So let's say up to an inch per kilometer of wetlands. So per kilometer of wetland, right? So, I mean, imagine you are somewhere in New York City and you want to reduce a surge that's coming in multiple feet. You need kilometers of wetlands in front of you or separating you from the coast for that surge to be reduced to a significant amount. So, this is a situation where wetlands may not be, are not the way to reduce our exposure to surges, but to the extent that floods are caused by storm-driven wind waves, there's good research on the friction, that what happens to a wave as it moves through a wetland, it is dissipated. There's been some interesting research in Jamaica Bay by Stevens Institute that looks at the restoration of shallow water habitat. And, we do know that shallow water habitat can increase friction of incoming waves, and that can reduce surges, right? We do know that by daylighting streams, there's interesting stuff happening in New York City with Tibbetts Brook. We can dissipate fluvial floodwaters. We can take the water out of combined sewer systems. We do know that vegetation canopies, so tree canopies, can prevent soil erosion because as a raindrop hits the top of a tree, its kinetic energy is dissipated, and therefore, we can conserve the soils underneath it. And we know that green infrastructure can reduce local and moderate fluvial flooding. But as we show on the right, this is a graphic. These curves are a number of recent extreme events. And we just sort of put them all on the same time axis. So going from the beginning of the storm to the right, going to the end of the storm, and then on the vertical axis is the cumulative inches of precipitation. And so the steeper the lines are, the more intense, the greater the accumulation of precipitation over time. So think of that as the steeper the lines, the more intense the storm was, and where the lines even out and become horizontal, that's the maximum amount of precipitation. So you can see, looking at Henri, looking at Irene, looking at the green one there is Ida, where they plateau is way above the 1.85 inches that for site connection proposals for combined sewers, or the 1.5 inches for house connections. So the point here is that even if we build green infrastructure to code, it is not intended to be big enough to address some of these much larger events that we're getting. It will saturate. And so if you want the green infrastructure to really not only assist us with managing sewer overflows, but also assist us with managing flooding, we need to dramatically scale up green infrastructure and accompany it with other gray infrastructure in certain places. So this is sort of like the take-home message, that in the short term, we really need to assume that we could flood. As I mentioned, the pluvial flood risks are everywhere. And so there's really interesting stuff happening globally, also in New York City with the cloudburst work that's underway, in figuring out how cities can be safe to flood as sort of a resilience approach. In the long term, yes, it would be nice to eliminate flooding, but we need to do a whole bunch of stuff to reduce emissions and dramatically transform things before that's going to happen. And in the short term, we are at risk to, in particular, pluvial flooding, but also coastal flooding. And so we sort of make a pitch to developing ways that the city can become safe to flood. And we talk about how this has to become a dialogue. And here we talk about sort of like a historical state on the left, the conventionally developed state where we are right now, and then a future transformed state. And we talk about the fact that if we don't do anything, we're already at a very high level of flood risk. Climate change is going to make it worse. In the future, we're going to get to a lower level of risk, but there really needs to be a discussion amongst multiple stakeholders and city government about where we want to be, because the changes that we're contemplating to reduce flood risks are quite dramatic and require a lot of investment and a lot of sort of physical and social changes to the layout of the city. And so that's not really a set of decisions that anyone can make by themselves. It's an argument here for collaboration and participation among multiple stakeholders as we think about where we want to be in the future. So I'll just sort of end it here because I'm feeling bad that I went over. There's no singular approach to equitable flood risk management, but it needs to really include a combination of structural and non-structural and nature-based solutions. And we need to also think significantly about how to engage community stakeholders in the process of decision-making and reduce overall vulnerability to have an equitable future. So I'll stop it there, and happy to talk to other people later in a different setting if we don't have the time now for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think let's just see it. Yes, exactly. Well done. Just if you can show with the raise hand function, if you have a question that you would be interested. I just want to see how many questions we might have. Okay, one. And then I had a question too, if you'll humor me. I had a question about, given the work of VIA, what recommendations would you have for the fact that the long-term control plans are using 2007 data, rain data for their, by the DEP?
I think it's 2008, but I understand your point.
2008.
Yeah. I think the long-term control plan is a long-term control plan. So, I think flood risk and combined sewer overflow control are two different things that we're trying to do, right? So there is certainly a value that interventions that are planned to reduce the water quality impacts of combined sewer overflows can have for reducing flood risks. But I also don't think that that can be the only approach, right? We need to, the flood risks the flood hazards, as I think I showed, and as we experienced with Ida and other recent events, are really way above what we can accomplish with ordinary green infrastructure, right? And so, I mean, if you change it to 2008, you change it to 2024, or another rainier year, it's still not addressing these extreme events of the future. And I don't think that, it will, we can't adjust the long-term control plan to deal with extreme future precipitation events. That's not what it was designed to do. So I think the long-term control plan needs to be accompanied by a separate set of interventions that we make to increase flood resilience. And as I said, those are both structural and non-structural.
Beautiful. Thank you. Graham, we'll have you ask your question and then we will move on to Cody. Go ahead.
Hi, Graham Birchall here. Really, two questions. The first is, I'm well aware of these sort of intense rainstorms. The one flood protection project which is being built in New York City right now is Battery Park City Resiliency Project in Lower Manhattan. And they have a pump to deal with the problem of rain and storm surges combined. But when you look at the capability of the pump, it's about less than an inch of rain per hour. So who's validating those, which is clearly way too low, right? I mean, in the future we're going forward, that's just not going to solve the problem they're trying to solve. so the obvious question is, what standard is the city expecting when we put a pumping system in to deal with a combination of rain, storm, and harbor surge?
Yeah, I mean, the city's got a variety of consultants working on these projects in different places, and the decision about how big a pump should be is really a function of a variety of things, right? I mean, it might be okay for a certain area to flood temporarily, and I'm not familiar with that particular pump that you're talking about and what the conditions are, but in certain places, where you've got some kind of protection along the coast and then some kind of possibility of accumulation of precipitation behind it, it's a matter of sort of getting that water out at some rate, even if it temporarily accumulates. But, there's a discussion that needs to be had about, this is where I got into safe to flood, right? We need to sort of figure out how to flood safely in certain places, and then to eliminate that flood water so that life can go back to where it was before. But I mean, some of these, it's just not feasible to design a pump to approach the intensity of the precipitation that we're beginning to see, right? That's
the dilemma I'm bringing up. In Lower Manhattan, there's nowhere where you can put the water. Either you move it or you flood. There's just no option here except that. And if you don't have a big enough pump, then you flood, which is kind of defeating the purpose. Which really gets to my second question. I know you're talking about resiliency, and I've just got my doubts. The city is not resilient to nuclear warfare. It's not resilient to a meteorite attack. It's not resilient to even a pandemic, as we know. And yet there's a sort of a sales pitch here that somehow we can be resilient to global warming. And that we're going to build all this infrastructure and be resilient. And I'm just not buying it. At what point do we have to tell people this is not going to work? And you need to.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree that this should not be in lieu of efforts to reduce emissions and to reduce the scale, and the pace of climate change, which is already baked in and already happening, right? So, you can't sort of go on happily continuing to do the status quo and then say that a couple of resilience strategies are going to protect you. That absolutely not. Our role with the NPCC was to review the work that's out there and to put in this report what are the strategies that people are talking about, and to evaluate the sort of pros and cons of those approaches. And I think you'll see when you read the report that we're quite sober about what we can and cannot accomplish with the flood risk management strategies that are out there. And hence why I said, I think we need to be thinking about making the city safe to flood in the short term, because the scale at which a lot of these interventions that I'm talking about would need to be implemented to significantly protect us against the most extreme of the future events, or even the extreme events that occurred today, is quite significant. So it's, I agree with you. I mean, the climate change is occurring at a rate that is really worrisome. And these are things that we can do, which we were sort of asked to review, but they need to be in a local way in each community, sort of evaluated next to the goals that those communities have for their future. And I, for one, don't think that there should be an external group that comes into a community and says this community should be told to leave, because I don't think that that is consistent with our approach to equity, right? I think that we want to have, there are places where we choose to protect and places that we don't choose to protect, and the places where you choose to invest in and places we don't choose to invest in. And that conversation is a really important conversation. And I think, if nothing else, that's where this has to go, is a more equitable sort of set of participatory conversations about what the future of specific places should be and what we need takes to get there. I'm not sure I answered your question. It's a tough one, but.
Thank you so much. Just want to thank you again for what a wonderful gift you've just given us. Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
being
you for the opportunity. It was great.
Yeah. And next we have Cody, who is going to be presenting on water quality results of this past season. So go take it away, Cody.
Hey everyone, my name is Cody. Can you see my whole browser?
I see the slide on the side.
Okay, cool.
Yes, do the slideshow and that's good.
Awesome. Great. My name is Cody. I'm with Billion Oyster Project. I am the Senior Community Science Coordinator, and I help coordinate our community water quality testing program, lovingly called CWQT, and formerly the Citizens Water Quality Testing Program. So we just wrapped our 20-week sampling season at the end of September, and we'll share some of the data with you. What is water quality? Water quality can mean a lot of things. In the CWQT world, we're really just talking about bacteria, and specifically enterococcus bacteria. So enterococcus is a fecal indicator that lives in in the intestinal tracts of warm-blooded mammals. So it basically tells you if there's poop in the water when you find it out in the harbor. We test harbor water for enterococcus instead of E. coli because it survives a little bit better in salt water. So kind of a similar indicator is something like E. coli, but it survives more in salt water. Enterococcus isn't necessarily the bacteria that's going to get you sick if you come in contact with it. But again, it does indicate that there could be other harmful bacteria in that sample. How does enterococcus or poop get into New York City's harbor? And I think a lot of you guys know this, but New York City has a wastewater and a stormwater problem. So about 60 to 70% of New York City has what we call a combined sewage system. So that's when raw and untreated stormwater and sewage is expelled through basically large tunnels on the edge of New York City's shoreline during wet weather events. And the other 30 to 40% of New York City is on what we call a municipal, or on a separate stormwater system, a separate sewage system, where a lot of that stormwater is going directly into the harbor, whether or not it's raining. And then I hear there's like 5% of the city has like weird direct drainage or like funny unpermitted things or septic systems. But for those of you that are less familiar, here's a diagram of what happens in a combined sewage system. So on a dry day, can you guys see my cursor? Does that share? Okay, awesome. So on a dry day, you flush your toilet at home, that water goes into a pipe underground, and then it's pumped off to a wastewater treatment plant where the water is cleaned for all bacteria like enterococcus, and then put back out into the harbor. On a rainy day, you have all that wastewater from your home and also all the rainwater from the roads and the streets going into the same pipes. There are about 700 municipalities in the United States that have this issue with combined sewage. A lot of them are older cities on the eastern seaboard. Excuse me. Older cities on the eastern seaboard that were built kind of earlier before we knew what an issue this type of sewage system could be, where you're just dumping wastewater out into the harbor when there's limited capacity. So I guess y'all are good on combined sewage overflow. Stop
Think
me if
so.
you're not. Yeah, right? Y'all know. Also a quick shout out to geese, because we have a lot of little beaches and stuff that we sample at that really have, a lot of goose poop and high enterococcus numbers because of that. As many of you know, what's the problem with putting sewage and stormwater in our harbor? It's kind of gross. It looks bad, it smells bad, it's unsafe for humans and wildlife. And in some cases, you can really see financial disinvestment in communities and areas that might have worse sewage overflow. Mitigation of this overflow and pollution can happen through upgrades to wastewater treatment plants and facilities, retention of stormwater and sewage through great infrastructure and storage tanks, or things like green infrastructure and rain gardens, which detain stormwater and then release it back out into the environment slowly. So I can breeze through a lot of this, but this is a map of all the MS4 areas, the separate sewage areas that the city has up on their website. You can find this pretty easily. Here is a map from Open Sewer Atlas where you can actually see the individual sewage sheds and which sewage overflow they flow into. Am I freezing?
No, you're fine.
Okay, awesome. I've frozen on my side, which is exciting. But anyway, map of combined sewage overflows. I strongly encourage you guys to figure out where your toilet flushes to during wet weather if you don't already know. When you look at the Department of Environmental Protection's website, the information they give you about sewage overflow location is really based on tiers. And these red dots represent some of the largest combined sewage overflows by flow in the city. And you can see a lot of them are in smaller tributaries like Newtown Creek, like the Bronx River, Westchester Creek, Flushing Creek, Bowery Bay, places that don't have as much tidal flow. So we typically see a lot of kind of chronic sewage pollution in those areas. And seagulls, yeah, shout out to seagulls. My computer is definitely having a tough time and my screen sharing is paused.
Do you want to try shutting your camera off just to preserve bandwidth?
Sure. I'm trying to resume, but I'm getting a spinny wheel.
Oh dear.
I know that's not good. And we're tight on time. I can stop sharing.
It's a Google slide, yeah?
Yeah.
Do you want to share the link with Michelle and me, and one of us can maybe?
Yes, if I can. I can't even exit presentation mode right now.
Oh dear.
Okay, I think it's Chrome that's bugging out. But anyway, the Community Water Quality Testing Program was originally founded by the New York City Water Trails Association. A lot of you probably know Rob Buchanan, who helped start that program. And I think in around 2020, while Rob was working for Billion Oyster Project, we saw a lot of our labs that were involved with this enterococcus testing. They were unable to accept samples because of the pandemic. A lot of them were like academic institutions that couldn't have community scientists coming in and dropping off samples. So that's when Billion Oyster Project started taking a larger role in the program and switched the name from the Citizens Water Quality Testing Program to the Community Water Quality Testing Program. If that is helpful history that we can talk through. My computer is really sad right now. I don't know how much more I can stall, to be quite honest.
No, I'm sorry, Cody.
I know.
Do you want to tag out with Emily or Drew, and then we'll come back to you when your computer's feeling better?
I guess so. That's got to be the only option.
I'm sorry about that.
No,
Yeah, and
I'm
also
sorry.
send us the link and we'll have it as backup when you come back.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm just gonna try to exit Zoom.
Okay.
Okay, I'll be back. Sorry, guys.
No worries.
Hey, Cody.
It happens. Emily or Drew, are you ready to go?
Hi, everybody. Yes, I am ready. Cody,
Thank you.
I am sad to see that happen, and I'm looking forward to the remainder of your presentation. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. I know a lot of folks on the call here. My name is Emily Ruby. I use they, them pronouns, and I work with Riverkeeper. And today I'm going to be presenting on renewable Rikers. And so just to say regarding renewable Rikers, Riverkeeper is a member of the Renewable Rikers Coalition. And so this presentation was developed in concert with that coalition and represents the, kind of an overall of the entire project, but I have pulled out and included some extra slides that particularly focus on the proposed wastewater treatment plant for this audience. So Drew, we can go to the next slide. So as mentioned, Renewable Rikers is a coalition. It's made up of a large group of formerly incarcerated individuals, decarceration and prison justice advocates, environmental justice organizations, environmental groups, and others, all of whom believe that the future of the island lies in sustainability. So community visioning. Renewable Rikers, it's the community consensus vision plan that began with those directly affected by incarceration. And we believe it's the best, most tangible path to restorative justice in the future use of Rikers Island, and that's through environmental justice and green job development. Moving on, you know, obviously when we're talking about renewable Rikers, we need to first talk about Rikers Island and its current use. And that starts out by saying New Yorkers know, right? Rikers needs to close. And the goal of this coalition is to ensure, as the jails are closed on Rikers Island, that the island's future uses benefit and respond to the wishes of the people and communities that have been harmed through its long and painful history. I'll briefly talk about Rikers today. As is widely known, the jail conditions on Rikers are inhumane. 90% of people incarcerated on Rikers are awaiting trial, incarcerated before conviction, and often because they cannot afford bail. Conditions at Rikers Island are deadly. At least 32 people have died awaiting trial since Mayor Adams took office. There is a pervasive and deep-seated culture of violence at Rikers Island, according to the Justice Department, and buildings are in a state of disrepair, causing incarcerated people to live in inhumane conditions. And I just want to emphasize that Black New Yorkers are disproportionately impacted, incarcerated at Rikers at 11 times the rate of white New Yorkers. So really, when we talk about Rikers, this is a justice issue, this is an environmental justice issue. So, you know, New York City Council took action on Rikers. The Renewable Rikers Coalition worked together with former council member Constantinides in 2021 to develop and lobby for the passage of 3 New York City bills that set the closure date for the jail and required 2 separate feasibility studies for the island. And so as follows, those laws included one that was passed to establish a process to transfer control of Rikers Island from the Department of Correction to other agencies for sustainability and resiliency purposes. And that set the date of closure for the jail in 2027. Local Law 17 was passed, which required New York City to determine the feasibility of what renewable energy and large-scale battery storage could be sited on the island. And Local Law 31 required a feasibility study for organics and wastewater processing on Rikers Island, which is what we are going to focus on largely today. So moving on to the next slide, key to the renewable Rikers is, as I've said, closing Rikers. And so we are very pleased with the notice of this legislation for 2027 closure, but we need the Adams administration to get back on track to close the complex. So, renewable Rikers, what comes next? And so our vision as a coalition and as a community is the Renewable Rikers Coalition. Sorry, there's some construction going on. So renewable Rikers, when the jails close, the land could be repurposed for uses that improve community health and quality of life for all New Yorkers, particularly those in the Southern Bronx and Northern Queens who have been most impacted by a series of most impacted. The Renewable Rikers Coalition, we support the development of renewable energy, battery storage, and wastewater treatment, as well as food scrap and yard waste composting on the site. And by establishing these systems, we could close noxious, peaker power plants and aging wastewater treatment facilities that disproportionately burden communities of color. So the feasibility studies that were called for in 2021 were released in March of 2024 this year. And they found that indeed establishing a wastewater treatment plant on Rikers Island is feasible, and that it would help improve water quality significantly. It also found that solar energy production, an offshore wind energy converter station, and battery storage housed on the island could significantly increase the renewable energy produced by the city, and that an organics processing could generate biogas to help power the wastewater treatment plant and help take trucks off the road. And I would highly recommend to everybody here that you take a look at the feasibility study, particularly the one put out by DEP on the proposed wastewater treatment plant. Shifting over to the next slide. So again, right, the Southern Bronx and Northern Queens are disproportionately impacted by the polluted air and water. Known as Asthma Alley, the Southern Bronx has been inundated by poor air quality caused by peaker power plants. And here in the slide, you can see there are 5 peaker power plants in the vicinity of Rikers Island in the Southern Bronx and Northern Queens that could be phased out with increased renewable energy being developed on the island. And then here in blue, these blue dots are the 4 aging wastewater treatment plants that are currently, providing wastewater treatment to these areas of the city, and that would be replaced or we'll get into it, but in some senses replaced by a new wastewater treatment plant on Rikers Island. Going to the next slide, very glad to have had the introduction from Cody on the Open Sewer Atlas map, as well as on CSOs. I know that this group is very familiar with combined sewage outfalls. So as you can see, this is a section of the Upper East River. There are more than 450 CSOs citywide, but the Upper East River and its tributaries are just lined with them. Nearly 55%, I believe, of the city's CSOs go into this area and are discharged into this area every year. And these overflows could be routed to the new plant to avoid discharges and improve water quality for fishing and swimming. So the Renewable Rikers effort could consolidate 4 aging wastewater treatment plants that we saw in the prior map. And then those 4 treatment plants, one of the ideas from DEP would be to maintain those 4 plants and have them be used to treat wet weather flow. So when there is an extreme or any rain event, right, it would increase capacity to deal with CSOs, and these 4 plants would be responsible for handling the CSOs and wet weather volume, while the new plant on Rikers Island would also be functioning. And this would help to further restore waters and make them safe for swimming and fishing, ideally in the Upper East River. To add a couple more facts on, the new wastewater treatment plant, the cost is estimated to be $34 billion, which has a very, obviously large price tag. But what the feasibility found was that is about equal to the estimated cost of necessary upgrades to the existing 4 wastewater treatment plants. So when you think of, these plants are aging, they're at kind of at the end of their life cycle. They've also exceeded the land capacity for where they're each sited. So it's very challenging for DEP to build in more capacity to each of those plants. And so they also are in grave need of upgrade. So money is going to have to be spent in this area on wastewater treatment. And the question is DEP going to spend that money on these 4 plants, some of which are 90 years old, or are they going to build a new, resilient, and more efficient system on Rikers Island? The wastewater treatment plant would take up about 245 acres of land, which is about 60% of the island, and that would leave the other 40% for other uses, including for renewable energy generation. And as I said, the 4 existing sites would be, used to treat CSOs during CSO events. So moving on to the next slide. The Hunts Point. So this is an image of how the 4 existing treatment plants would be connected to the new treatment plant on Rikers Island. And this illustrates, from Hunts Point to the proposed Rikers Island wastewater treatment plant, a connecting tunnel. And so there's a couple things I want to, add in here for this audience, but particularly, right, each of these 4 tunnels would contain 2 fully redundant conveyance pipes. And I've included a schematic of what one of these conveyance pipes would look like. And this would allow for periodic shutdowns, for inspections, cleaning, and maintenance. It would allow for storage of CSO during wet weather events, which would further increase the capacity to manage CSO. And it would allow for flexibility for future projects aimed at reducing CSOs and neighborhood flooding by increasing underground water storage. It also creates a redundant pipe from each existing facility and essentially modifies a typical CSO storage tunnel and would allow a new wastewater treatment on Rikers Island to maximize all overall wet weather capacity. So at several places along the design of this wastewater treatment plant and its connection to the 4 former plants. They're building in storage. The concept is to build in increased capacity to hold CSOs and hold wet weather, and stormwater during a event, so as to prevent further CSO. Going to the next slide, talk a little bit about resiliency. One of the other benefits of a renewable Rikers is that they would build resiliency into the plan. So, wastewater treatment plants are obviously sited along the waterfront. They are at risk from coastal storm surge, particularly, but also other forms of climate change, including sea level rise. And so creating, in the Rikers feasibility study and in the plan, they would build this treatment plant to be resilient with our changing climate. And I think that's a really important piece when we're thinking about these kind of infrastructure upgrades, because those other 4 plants have basically gone to the limits of their available land. It makes it a lot more challenging for them to add resiliency to those 4 sites. But when you're starting out with a new site on a new site, you're able to kind of think ahead of time and plan for that aspect of climate change. And then moving on to the next slide, this is from the feasibility study. It's just some top line numbers about renewable Rikers. So as mentioned, it would cost $34 billion. It would begin treating sewage in 2045, though the last tunnel wouldn't be connected until 2060. It would capture about 705 million gallons per day, and would have a peak capacity of wet weather flow at 1,400 million gallons per day. So those were kind of the top 1 numbers I wanted to emphasize from this graph. It's definitely something we're very excited about. And when we think about opportunities for the city to establish new state-of-the-art treatment plants, we see the Renewable Rikers project is really the main opportunity. So moving on, I'm just going to talk briefly about renewable energy at Rikers. So we've talked about wastewater, we've talked about improvements to water quality and resiliency. The other 40% of the land on Rikers could be used for renewable energy, and we would like to see it used for renewable energy to mainly also help phase out nearby asthma-causing natural gas-fired peaker power plants in the southern Bronx and northern Queens. These peaker plants are having a detrimental effect on community health, emitting harmful pollutants like nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides, in addition to greenhouse gases. And a renewable energy hub would help to provide the energy needed to shutter these peaker plants, and also provide hundreds of green jobs in the process. So we are definitely excited about that opportunity. And going to the next slide, this is a zoom in of the 5 existing peaker power plants that were mentioned earlier that are in the surrounding area. And these will be targets for closure if and when renewable Rikers came online. So as we get close to the end here, I think, one thing to emphasize, I want to emphasize also, is that Rikers, it's been called on to close by 2027, and it's not really suitable for other purposes. It's made up of 83% landfill, which also includes a lot of coal ash, garbage, pollutants. The foundation of garbage and fill releases methane. And it also is likely that it causes PAHs associated with the coal ash to be also released. Further, the island is so close to LaGuardia Airport, there are extreme height limits placed on what can be built there. Further emphasizing that, we need to get creative when you think about a future for Rikers, and that's why we're emphasizing the possibility of a renewable Rikers here. So there's no easy way to get to the island. There's only one bridge. And that one bridge, interestingly, is from Astoria, folks might know, even though the island is technically within the Brooks. So you can only access it via Astoria, and it causes, more limited usage value for the island after the jails are closed. And I just want to end The main goal and one of the main goals of this project really is restorative environmental justice. The future land use of the island should benefit those who have been harmed by Rikers, and this includes taking meaningful steps to improve air and water quality for environmental justice communities, where the overwhelming majority of prisoners on Rikers are from. In addition to clean air and clean water, it's our hope that some of the land currently occupied by the peaker plants and possibly the wastewater treatment plants will be returned to community use, and that in the process of creating a renewable Rikers, there will be high-skill, local green jobs created to construct and operate the new infrastructure. And lastly, I have a slide just on how to make renewable Rikers a reality. And so please join our coalition. You can find us at renewablerikers.org, and you can join our letter urging the mayor to formally agree to pursue the renewable Rikers vision for the future of the island and close the prison according to the lawful timeline. So that is my presentation, and I am happy to take some questions if folks have any.
Thank you, Emily. That was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions?
I'll just add that at Riverkeeper, we are very supportive of renewable Rikers. You know, we see this as the main way to transform water quality in a meaningful way, particularly in the Upper East River. There are not a lot of opportunities to build new wastewater treatment plants. They take up a lot of land, and that is something that we are short of in New York City. And so this is a community-supported vision plan that has been found to be feasible by the mayor's office. So, you know, we're just very excited about it. Graham, what's your question?
Really just a further question about the renewable energy hub. And of course, it's not really making a significant amount of renewable energy. It's storing it. It's coming from somewhere else. And right now, really since the closing of Indian Point, New York City is running on natural gas to make electricity pretty well 24/7. Not in the city so much, there are the peaker plants, but upstate. I know there's some hydro, there's some Quebec stuff, but until we get the offshore wind in, we don't have a source of renewable energy. So aren't you kind of dependent on that coming online for this not to just be using more fossil fueled energy from somewhere else?
Well, I mean, we do anticipate there will be I'm not as versed in the renewable energy side of this project since I've focused mainly on the wastewater treatment. But what I will say is we do anticipate a significant amount of energy be generated on the island largely from solar. And to your point, as well as there'll be battery storage, but further there will, we are anticipating an offshore wind energy converter station to be established on the island as part of the renewable energy side of things, right? And so
does that mean running a cable up the Hudson or something? I mean, how do you get that electricity?
Not up the Hudson. My understanding of this, and I have to say, I don't have a deep understanding of the offshore wind converter station, but it would be a transfer station, a converter station, where offshore wind sites, off of Long Island, would be able to come and be converted at that station and then provide power. So I'm not entirely certain the processes there, Graham, I'll be honest, but I do know that finding sites for these converter stations is one of the challenges with offshore wind in the city right now. And so the fact that this is also going to be opening up a potential site at Rikers is one of the main benefits of the site.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily. I believe we have Cody back, so let's switch back to Cody and then we'll get Drew after Cody is finished.
Yeah, let's try it. Thanks, y'all. Sorry about that. I'm gonna keep my camera off, I guess. Maybe that's better. So we left off on the slide. Y'all know about CSOs, so we're good. So who monitors enterococcus in New York City? You know, the Department of Environmental Protection is typically doing mid-channel measurements throughout the 5 boroughs. The New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene is doing our public beaches, surf riders doing surfing beaches. Riverkeeper does a lot of the Hudson and its tributaries. The Long Island Sound Study also does some enterococcus testing, and the Community Water Quality Testing Program really focuses on waterfront access points throughout the 5 boroughs that are kind of more informal. And are typically tested by local partners and community scientists. So again, this program just celebrated its 13th season. Billion Oyster Project has really only been heavily involved with it since 2020. But over the lifespan of the project since 2012, we've collected over 10,000 samples from 135 different locations, processed by 17 different partner labs. So we have quite a big data set if you are ever interested in looking at it. You know, the way the program really works is we have our community scientists go out and sample on Thursday mornings, and they bring their samples to a lab by Thursday afternoon. They spend 24 hours in the incubator, which means we have results by Friday afternoon, and we send out a newsletter that gives people all the information they need to know for their weekend recreation, and kind of the most up-to-date bacteria numbers for that. Here are some of our 2023 partners. Here are some of our 2023 partner labs. It's really like a who's who of all your best friends in water world. I'm sure a lot of you participate in this program one way or another. We have a site map. You can find it online on our water quality website on the Billion Oyster Project page. Again, over 135 sites in the history of the program. This year, we were processing 93 every week in partnership with 10 labs altogether, I believe. This is what our data sheets look like, and we're comparing this data to New York City Department of Health enterococcus standards traditionally, those standards for primary contact or swimming, and they measure the most probable number, very similar to CFU, except CFU, when you're measuring CFU, it's like something that grows in a petri dish, and MPN is not. It's kind of suspended in the material itself. You know, you guys kind of know this stuff. You use this data, you know, it can inform boaters and swimmers and other water users when it's safe to explore their local waterways, and really paired with other rainfall information and tide information, that's how you can kind of make the best decisions and most informed decisions about this water quality results. Let's see. So again, what does it mean to be swimmable? Traditionally, this program has talked about the New York City Department of Health enterococcus standards for swimming, the same tests that our beaches are compared to. But really, a lot of New York City's harbor is not rated for swimming. So we see most of our water bodies, especially the ones that we sample through the CWQT program, are Class I water bodies. And that's a lot of this green area on the map, like the Hudson River along Manhattan, the East River, you know, just a lot of what we sample typically. Up until last October, there were no standards for Class I water bodies for enterococcus. It's fairly new. So we can now start comparing our most probable number of enterococcus to these Class I standards. So here is a little more kind of growth and stats from the water quality program. This year, again, we did 93 samples, which is the most we've ever been reporting on a weekly basis for the 20-week season. We had 10 labs this year, and the breakdown is basically Billion Oyster Project's lab in Williamsburg and the Interstate Environmental Commission are carrying a lot of these samples and doing a lot of the processing. Labs like the Sarah Lawrence, Curb Institute, and Bronx River Alliance sample a lot more than they report to our water quality testing program. So, you know, they kind of have autonomous programs kind of running outside of, you know, our typical range of New York City's harbor, the saline waters that we're working with. But again, these are some of our partners and how much they're testing. This year we processed 1,515 samples. Again, a lot of data. I hope somebody here wants to look at it more. And this, we're going to start comparing last year to this year. And last year we saw that out of, you know, just the individual samples taken, we had 44.4% of them were acceptable for swimming based off those New York City Department of Health standards. And about 35.7% of them were not safe for swimming and totally unacceptable bacteria levels. That really changed looking at 2024. So we see a decrease in our acceptable for swimming days, where the bacteria count is under 35 MPN, and we see an increase in the days that were really unacceptable for swimming, while that middle range, unacceptable if levels persist, kind of stays the same. So that's a really kind of big jump and big difference that we saw this year. Again, looking at last year, we've been putting together the geometric means for the sites. That's kind of the best way to look at the average most probable number value. And something to keep in mind here is the lowest most probable number that we have is 11.5, roughly. And the highest that we saw in these geometric means was 1,239. And interestingly enough, the sites that we sampled last year, it really broke down into like perfect thirds, with about a third of them being safe for swimming based off their geometric means, about a third of them kind of being in that unsafe if levels persist range, and then a third of them just being chronically polluted with sewage. And again, that's a lot of our smaller tributaries, the usual suspects that you might suspect are pretty polluted. We saw a change this year where, okay, so we got to be honest, these Raritan Bay sites didn't really submit a lot of data. So they really don't have as much, I don't know, I'm not going to look at them. You know, we're going to start here at Pier 40. So the MPN at Pier 40 basically doubled from last year, where it was 16.23. Now we're seeing this like 21.90 number, where we used to see last year these lower MPNs of like 11 MPN. So now our lowest MPN really with the most data is 21.90 MPN. And also if we look at the most polluted in Perth, Amboy, New Jersey, you know, the MPN, the highest MPN geometric mean we have is 2,876. Last year, that number was only 1,239. So from what we can tell from this data, not only have we kind of seen this shift from swimmable sites to less swimmable sites, but the amount of bacteria seems to be higher based off these MPN numbers. Interestingly, and again, this obviously doesn't break down in perfect thirds. You kind of see that shift of kind of the cleaner sites moving over to the kind of hazardous side of our water quality spectrum. This is kind of interesting because we had less rain than we had last year. So last year overall during our water quality sampling season, we had 22.74 inches of rain. This year we only had 18.628. Again, the weekly breakdown isn't that different. But really different rainfall numbers, or really different data compared to the rainfall numbers. We also started comparing things to those Class I water body standards and also the SB sites, because they have their own enterococcus standards. This is looking at the 2023 data. You know, things were kind of meeting the mark every once in a while. It wasn't all the time. But compared to the 2024 data, you see a dramatic decrease in the amount of Class I water bodies that are meeting the standards that were put out by the DEC last year. So again, you know, we're just looking at colors here. I hope you don't have the type of color blindness that prevents you from seeing contrast between green and red. That's always one of my biggest fears when presenting this. But again, so we saw those MPN values really raise from last season to this season, and then we see kind of the passing rate for swimmable standards based off the DEC water body classifications or the New York City Department of Health kind of beaches standards. You know, nobody's really doing as good as they were last year. And, you know, let's talk about it, I guess, is where we end.
Wow. That's all I have to say is wow. I'm wondering if you can you go back and put your last colored slides back up, please?
Yeah. Sure.
And I know we've already talked about it, just you and I, but have you looked at the oh wait, no, you did. You said that each of the dates when they were high had not had rain within a 72-hour period, right?
There were some weeks towards the end of the season this year in September, where, you know, it wasn't the type of rainfall that you might expect to see dramatic decreases in water quality, but we still had you know, the majority of sites not reporting swimmable water.
And when you have done these analyses, have you verified with DEP whether there were CSO events?
We typically haven't looked at that in the past, but that's definitely a way we can boost our data analysis and kind of what we're doing with all this.
Okay, I'm done. Does anyone else have any other quick comments, questions, or feedback?
Okay, and make sure to find your favorite water body on this page. And remember, it's MPN. You can take a screenshot now. And I can share the link out also with folks in the chat, so you can check it out.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Cody.
That's really upsetting. This is Judy Weiss. And there doesn't seem to be any explanation for it. I mean, like more rain or something. It's, I mean, this really needs to be looked into further. It's really inexplicable what's going on there. And it wasn't just in a few different water bodies, it was very widespread.
Yeah, can you guys still hear me? My computer is definitely freaking out in the same way it was. I'm trying to join on my phone to maybe salvage this. At first I was kind of self-conscious. Many of you might know that I went to art school, not school for science. So I was like, oh, is our lab just completely wrong and messing up? But you see these types of increases in the overall MPN measurement kind of throughout every lab. So that, you know, reassured me that it isn't just lab errors, but this was kind of happening harbor-wide.
How do you validate that you are getting consistent results from one year to the next?
A lot of our labs have quality assurance measures, whether they're formal quality assurance plans that are approved by the EPA or kind of other lab protocol. You know, the processes are pretty standard. We use the IDEX system throughout the CWQT program, which is one of, I think it's the only EPA approved test for enterococcus where you can get the results in such a short period of time. So we're all using the same methods and all have, you know, pretty rigid quality assurance throughout all the different labs. And happy to share more of those details. If you want to see those quality assurance plans, we can definitely share them.
Yulia?
Hi, Cody. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I wonder whether you collected their water temperature and is there any possible explanation to that shift from the change in the water temperature?
Like a seasonal change in water temperature, or when it's like just being held and sample collection kind of transported to the lab?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just also trying to think what could be the potential reason. And I wonder if that has to do with the fact that our water bodies are warming and every year we are facing like unprecedented warming of the water bodies as well. Did you try and understand any relationship in relation to that?
Yeah, I haven't done any analysis that combines temperature with the enterococcus data, but a lot of our labs and at select sites that Billion Oyster Project is testing too, people are collecting things like temperature, dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll, and other parameters as well. But traditionally, the CWQT program has just had community scientists going out and testing for enterococcus on Thursdays for 20 weeks a year since 2012.
I'm sure we could all sit here and talk for hours to try to tease out all these patterns. So if you have thoughts and you want to reach out to Cody, she's at Billion Oyster Project. But now I'd like to switch back to Riverkeeper and have Drew present on PCBs.
Thanks, everyone. My computer is also frozen. I don't know if I'm still sharing my screen, but I'm just gonna like turn myself off.
You're
Thanks
good,
for having
Cody.
me.
Thank you.
you.
Yeah, have a good one, y'all. Thanks.
So I was told I'm going to leave 10 minutes for the end for some follow-up items. So I'm going to fly through this presentation, and it's very difficult after following all those great speakers. It's especially challenging because this is not a stormwater issue, but there is a real opportunity on PCBs right now that I think is really critical to share with this group. And so, the presentation is about PCBs in the Hudson River. We'll skip the outline, none of it matters. PCBs are dangerous. They bioaccumulate, so they move up the food chain and they go from the little fish to humans. And so when we're consuming contaminated fish, you are consuming PCBs. PCBs were dumped into the Hudson River by General Electric from 1947 to 1977. It is a huge problem. It has been going on for so many years, and it remains a problem. But you can't smell the PCBs, you can't taste the PCBs, you can't see the PCBs, so it's a hard issue to always be aware of. And so I'm here to just remind everyone that PCBs are an issue, and they're an issue for 200 miles of the Hudson River, all the way from Hudson Falls, New York, to the Battery in New York Harbor. So this is not just an upriver issue, it impacts all of us. So General Electric PCBs are, in the city, they're in Westchester, they're in Albany. It's 200 miles. It is one of the largest Superfund sites in the country. And so while General Electric did do some dredging from 2009 to 2015, there are still PCBs that remain behind in the river and remain an issue. EPA selected a cleanup plan that involved targeted dredging in the upper Hudson River, which is Hudson Falls to the federal dam at Troy. And then they moved into a natural recovery phase. Now, PCBs are forever chemicals. They don't naturally break down, but when EPA refers to a natural recovery, they're hoping that, clean sediment's going to come into the system and bury them, or the PCBs are going to move out of the Hudson, and ultimately PCB concentrations in fish and sediment will continue to decline since the dredging. And so unfortunately, that is not what we're seeing. And so the cleanup plan also required fish consumption advisories to mitigate the risks from consuming contaminated fish, which is the #1 reason humans become exposed to PCBs. Fish consumption advisories are really quite complicated in the lower Hudson River, which is the portion of the river south of the federal dam at Troy. Upper Hudson River is easy. There's eat none. It is illegal to take any fish from the upper Hudson River home. Upper Hudson River, again, Hudson Falls to federal dam at Troy. But for the rest of the river, for the rest of the 160 miles of this Superfund site, it really depends on who you are, what the fish you're catching is, and where you're catching that fish. And I think that, these fish consumption advisories really aren't well known in the southern part of the Hudson River. But they are part of the institutional controls for the PCB cleanup program. And so we should be aware. If you are a woman under 50 or a child under 15, there is an eat none advisory. Do not eat any fish from the Hudson River. If you're a male or, anyone over 15, you might be able to eat some fish from the lower Hudson River, but again, make sure you check Department of Health's regulations. And so EPA has to continue to rely on those fish consumption advisories because the levels are not declining in accordance with their goals. I mean, they set forth goals to reduce concentrations in fish and sediment and to minimize the downstream transport of PCBs into the lower Hudson River. Yet PCBs remain a huge problem, and they're not achieving the goals that they set in 2002 when they adopted the cleanup plan. So this all matters. The reason I'm emphasizing this so much right now is because this summer EPA issued their third 5-year review for the Hudson River, and they're required every 5 years to evaluate whether the cleanup remedy, so the dredging and the monitored natural recovery, whether that plan is protective of human health and the environment. So in this third 5-year review that they just issued, they're looking specifically at data post-dredging, so from 2017 to 2021. They've also added in some 2022 data. Their conclusion is to defer rendering a protectiveness decision, which is what they did in the second 5-year review. So EPA says they don't have enough data. They're not going to say whether the remedy is protective of human health and the environment at this time. And so we have to wait for them to do more studies and to maybe issue an addendum and maybe give us a determination, they said, by 2027. But they're not giving us a determination now, which is frustrating. So just highlighting some fish data, one of the key targets that they set was an interim target of 0.4 milligram per kilogram PCB concentration in fish fillet. That is the top dotted line right here. And so their hope was that after dredging, which would occur between the orange and the green, that they would see the numbers hit 0.4 5 years after dredging, so 2020. These are the numbers. They're jumping around, kind of up and down, but not hitting this target. The smaller dotted line is the second interim target EPA set, which was a 0.2 milligram per kilogram PCB concentration in fish fillet. Just to show it another way, this is a graph that our experts produced that again show those fish concentration numbers from 2016 to 2021 and highlight the interim targets. We're not seeing the decline that is needed to achieve these numbers. So step one would be for EPA to recognize that they're not on the path to meet their interim targets, they're not achieving their goals, and to render a not protective determination in this third 5-year review. That doesn't mean they're going to go out there and start dredging. It just means they're going to reevaluate the remedy. Again, that dredging and the monitored natural recovery to see what changes are needed to get the Hudson River on a real path to recovery. And that includes the lower Hudson River as well, because ultimately our goal is to eliminate the fish consumption advisory so that people can eat the fish. This is a real environmental justice issue because we know that people are relying on fish. They are taking fish from the Hudson River and bringing it home to their families because either they don't know any different or, you know, they have to obtain some sort of food. And so we're very concerned that the fish consumption advisories are going to have to continue for decades to come without real action by EPA. So what to do? You know, I emphasize the importance of this because we have the July third 5-year review that came out. The public comment period on that draft third 5-year review ends next week on November 7th. And so now is the opportunity to send comments to EPA to urge them to adopt a not protective, to acknowledge that the Hudson River cleanup for PCBs is not on track to reach the goals they set forth in the record of decision. And so you can either email your comments to this email address I put on the board, or you can go to Riverkeeper's Action Alert. I'll throw this link in the chat. Our Action Alert page has some more information because I know I just kind of blew through the facts. Also, our website has some additional webinars that we've done on this that go more in depth. So feel free to check those out. I'll put links to them in the chat as well. But, you know, I just urge everyone to take action. Just because we're in the lower Hudson River doesn't mean that it's not our problem because it impacts us as well. And that is all I've got.
Thank you, Drew. That was amazing. And you were so speedy. I'm very impressed. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I would like to, if you want to reach out to Drew about this issue, please do so. Also follow the links that she's going to put in the chat. But at this point in time, we'd like to open it up to you all and ask if folks have any updates that they would like to share with the group. I know, Judith, you had something that you wanted to share, so I would love to invite you to go first. If you're ready. And if anybody else has anything, go ahead and raise your digital hand, and we will make you and put you in the lineup.
Yeah, can I turn on my video?
Give me 1 second. Go ahead. Do you want to share your screen? Is that what you're saying though?
No, I'll just pick up something and show it.
Okay.
But if I can just, my video won't come on.
Made you able to do that.
I've been clicking on it. Oh, here it is.
Yeah, I
Okay.
had it off for for security reasons.
Right. All right, I just want to tell people about my new book. And it's called Marine Pollution, What Everyone Needs to Know. It's a book for people like you. It's not a highly technical book. It's written for the public that's interested in marine pollution. It has a format of question and answer format. The different chapters focus on different types of pollution, such as, nutrients, metals, organic pollutants, and so forth. This is the second edition. The first edition from 10 years ago had a chapter called Marine Litter that focused largely on plastic. This edition now has a new chapter on microplastics, which all the chapters have been brought up to date. There's this new chapter about microplastics. This is from Oxford University Press. It costs $18.95. You can probably get it cheaper some other places. And I objectively recommend it to all of you. Marine pollution, what everyone needs to know. And I hope you get it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Judith. I'm excited about it. Does anyone else have any?
I do a quick one. I don't know if Rosanna wants to do this, but New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program has its annual conference on November 12th. I put the link for the conference website in the chat, so y'all should register and come. It's at the NYU Kimmel Center.
Thank you, Sheena. I'm just going to add that we did update the conference website, so it does have information about all of our speakers and sessions that we'll be covering on that day.
Does anyone else have any other updates? Oh no, now I feel guilty that I made all those speakers go so fast.
Well, maybe one of the speakers has something that they left out from their presentation that they're just itching to share.
Yeah. Or does anyone have any other questions that they were dying to ask a speaker, and even if our speaker isn't here anymore, we can communicate with them and get an answer to your question.
Oh, you know what we forgot to do? Introduce Rebecca, our new fellow. We should have done that at the beginning.
You're right. Rebecca, we're going to embarrass you.
Oh, great. Good timing.
Yeah, this is Rebecca Rice. She's our Swim Pratt Fellow for the year, right? Yeah. Do you want to give them just a little bit of background on what you're...
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Rebecca. I'm in the Pratt Sustainable Environmental Systems program in my second year. I'll be graduating in May, and I have a background in architecture. And just really interested in looking at, climate change, sustainability in the built environment. Glad to be here.
Well, wonderful. Then you all get 7 minutes of your lives back. Thank you so much for joining us today. Stay tuned for our registration link of the Cloudburst presentation by the DEP program. That will be, it'll be the week of November 18th, likely either the 19th, which is a Tuesday, or the 21st, which is a Thursday. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at SWIM. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Have a great night.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Drew and Emily.
Yes, thank you to all our speakers.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Judith, I can't wait to read your book.